Billy Waugh, to jump over to Surprise Kill Vanish, CIA paramilitary, if I may, right? Like, Billy was such an extraordinary person. You know, he started out as a source and he became a friend. And he only shared with me what he could, right? I mean, but it was clear that there was so much more going on. One of the last conversations I had with him, I was being asked to speak out in Palm Springs. I live in LA, and so there was a car service that drove me out. And I was like, in the car, I was like, I'm calling Billy, right? And that was in December. That was in November, and he died in April, right? So it was very close to his end, right? And he told me I told him I was writing the book on nuclear war, and he told me the craziest stories, like, and he told me about this mission that he was in Alaska for one of the nuclear tests that went off there. And I was like, Billy, what? Like, you never told me about this. I don't know about this. And, you know, he would chuckle, and it was like, you know, one millionth of what I did, right? He was an operator for the CIA starting when Eisenhower was in office. Right. White Star, you know. That was the program before the Vietnam War in Laos, right? That was a long, long time ago. And he worked for the agency almost straight through to the end, right? We know he went to Gaddafi. He went to Libya right before Gaddafi was killed. What was that, in 2011? I mean, he was in his 80s, you know? I mean, and who knows? He may have still been operating when we were working together. When he and I traveled to Hanoi. We traveled to Havana. I always got the sense that he was working, you know? There was always something going on because he was an incredible asset for the agency. I mean, Did you just feel untouchable traveling with him into the most dangerous parts of the world? I mean, okay, I'll tell you an interesting story. So right before we left, he came to my house. I live in Los Angeles, and actually, my husband's Norwegian, and my husband had a friend. Norwegian's my husband's mother tongue, and he had a friend, Per Ostein, visiting from Norway on a business trip. So we were all sitting in the garden, right, for this. And Billy was telling stories. We were about to go to Hanoi, and he also insisted on having $10,000 in cash in his back pocket. Okay. And I say, I mean, it sounds so apocryphal. It's actually true. And there are two witnesses, right? So he has this, I mean, he's got $100 bills folded up, and he's 87 and a half years old. And we're about to go to Hanoi. And we're sitting there in my garden, you know, eating dinner. And Billy's got this wad of cash. And I say to him, you know, Billy, that might not be a great idea to have that in a third world country, like $10,000 hanging out of your pocket like that, right? And like, I mean, it was like, what a dumb thing to say, okay? Like, right. Really and truly, like, this is Billy Waugh, you know what I mean? Like, he's operated around the whole world. He's got like, you know, bullet frags in his, I mean. He was taking jogs, running from Bin Laden's dogs. I mean, everyone's tried to kill him. He was invincible, and here I am telling him not to have this money. But on the other hand, like, it's kind of true. Like, he's 87, you know? And before I could finish the sentence, he has picked up a fork and thrust it into the wooden picnic table and said, anyone tries to, you know, and then he says like 10 swears, you know, with me, that's what's going to happen to them. And this fork, and we're all just looking at it, and this fork is just like, you know, in the table, right? Did he pay to get your table fixed? No, it didn't matter. It's just a wooden picnic table, right? But the point is, like, Billy, and like, why did I still think about that. Like, did that scare you? No. Billy, he comes off in your book as like this just old school kind of guy who's like this protective, like a knight in shining armor, who you could go anywhere and you would just be like, you would feel invincible with him. You know, he's the knuckle dragger assassin. But were there any moments where like that fork in the table that like gave you pause, be like, oh my God, this guy is
he is who I think he is. He's not just this,
The fork in the table was the only time that Billy broke the veneer of just being so calm. And, like that was an attack, right? And that was because I kind of insulted him, or at least that was his perception of that, right? But I liked I liked hearing John Kiriakou talk about Billy. It was amazing. And I loved also that he said that Billy swore all the time, because the truth of the matter is, this is the one quid pro quo I had with Billy, right? Billy swore. I mean, it was so fun to be around him, because like everybody has the little kid in them that, like, your mother tells you you're not supposed to swear constantly. And Billy, just every other word that came out of his mouth was a swear. But we made an agreement that in the book I wouldn't use the F word every other word, because it was disruptive. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, but I thought that was very interesting, because the knight in shining armor part of it was diffused by the fact that Billy had this vocabulary that was just, I have videos of him during the pandemic. We did a lot of Zooms to kind of stay in touch. Yeah, and maybe I'll put them up one day, because they're just apps. I mean, Billy would sit in his office and shoot the shit with me, and he would just tell old stories again and again, and they were just, it was really awesome. It was like great getting that stuff down on the record out of his mouth, right? Because he was really one of a kind. He was, I was at his funeral here in Tampa. I
was talking to Rick. He told me you were coming to town. I'm like, I gotta get her on the podcast. I gotta get her down here. Rick's like, you want me to kidnap her? I'm like, I don't know.
Those guys are funny. I mean, speaking of kidnapping, I once had a friend who got stuck in Morocco during the pandemic, right? Like, remember when that March 15th or whatever that was, when Trump closed the borders and like you could barely get back into the United States?
Oh, yeah.
And I had a friend my age who was stuck in Morocco. Oh, and no. And she was seriously worried. And I called up Rick and like some other guys, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we'll go get her.
No way.
It's going to be expensive, and she's going to have to come out by boat." But it was like they gave me a whole plan about how they could go get her, and it was like, wow, right? They were not kidding around.
Wow. Now, a lot of Billy's operations were, it sounded like, especially during the first few operations. I think his first one was to Libya. Is that right?
Well, that was after the Vietnam War.
Obviously after the Vietnam War. He started to go and work. He worked for the post office. Mm-hmm. And then it's like when he got hired on these covert operations, it seemed like there wasn't much communication. Like he wasn't sure who he was working for.
Always. I mean, he was a singleton, right? So that meant he operated alone for the most part. And that is a remarkable job, right? Mm-hmm. And when I interviewed Cofer Black, who is a very top CIA person during the whole War on Terror and was Billy's boss, and like I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something like, again, these guys always saying like, "Oh, Annie, like you really think you know anything," right? And he basically said like, you think you got all this stuff from Billy, but the truth of the matter is most of his career was spent getting verbal messages from guys like me with nothing written down. Wow. And that is just stunning to think about, that there's an element of the national security apparatus that functions like that, right? Mm. So what it really is president to Cofer Black to Billy Waugh. And Billy Waugh, right? And does that still go on? I don't know, right? But what I do know is being able to get Billy Waugh's story on the record was like a real privilege for somebody like me, because it's, okay, so if it's 1/1000th of the story, it's still an incredible through line of seeing one man operate through all these wars, right? And of course it culminates in the end of the book. That book leads me to nuclear war, which is, do you remember the scene I recreate when we're in Jop's garden in Hanoi?
Yes,
right?
I do.
So,
Yes.
so to set the stage for that, Billy was assigned to kill the leader of the North Vietnamese army, General Giap.
Right.
And General Giap, in many ways, was like more, I don't want to say more powerful than Ho Chi Minh, but was like, just as important, right? He led the army, and everybody followed him.
Right.
And the American government wanted him dead, like nobody's business. There was a perception that the Vietnam War would end if Giap was dead, right? Mm-hmm. And so Billy was assigned to kill him on this mission called Oscar 8, which I write about in Surprise, Kill, Vanish, and which Billy wrote about in his book, and is just a remarkable, shocking mission, okay? And so when we go back to Hanoi, Billy and I travel there, and we are set to meet with General Giap's son. Giap had died just a few years before, at like the age of over 100. And his son, Dien Bien, named after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the house, this gorgeous house, is not far from like the mausoleum where Ho Chi Minh lies in rest. And it's this magnificent house with a huge garden, and like basically it's a museum of Giap, right? There's medals, and I mean, it just, and also Giap's ashes are there, and like kind of there's like a Buddhist little temple that we went into. I mean, it was just wild, right? But we're sitting in the garden, and Dien Bien brought to the picnic, no pun intended, the man assigned to kill Billy Waugh, right? General Zhang, right? So it was just like two arch enemies meeting in their 90s. Billy wasn't quite yet in his 90s, but the colonel was, and they were like, and it was just wild to be discussing the war, to listen. I mean, they were discussing the war, I was listening, and then this subject comes up because, as I write in the book, Billy was part of the green light, and we talked about this earlier, the Area 51 bomb dropping when they jumped the nuclear weapon. That was a test to see if such a team like that, a green light team, would ever use that weapon in war, would ever use a tactical nuke, that thing that you and I have been saying must never happen, right? So in the 60s, this was a real thought. And the Defense Department looked long and hard about, wait a minute, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was this engineering masterpiece, this pathway through the jungle through which all these weapons were being run up and down and was fueling the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. And so the government had tried every which way to shut this trail down, and they couldn't. And a kind of one idea that got run by the Jason scientists, I write about this in The Pentagon's Brain, and then again in Surprise, Kill, Vanish from a different point of view. The idea was, well, we could drop it or place a tactical nuclear weapon on the trail, blow it up, and then it'll cut off, it's like cutting the artery.
Right.
And so in this, there we are in Hanoi in 2016, Billy Waugh and the archenemy, Colonel Zhang, talking to each other about what it was like to try and kill each other, and all their friends are dead and they're alive. And the subject comes up of this tactical nuclear weapon. And Billy says we should have used it. And Zhang and Dien Bien are like, excuse me? I mean, I write this out in the book. They're like, what? The Americans would never have done that. That's a ridiculous concept. And Billy explains to them that it was actually thought through and it was decided against. And Billy took the position that we should have used the tactical nuke. And I was shocked. They were shocked.
He thought like going back, I would have used it if it was my choice, or was he kind of?
Here's what he said, and I'm paraphrasing. It's actually sourced in the book of what he really said from the tape recorder. But he said something to the effect of, 58,000 of my, friends and countrymen died, and 1 million of your friends and countrymen died. One tactical nuclear weapon would have ended the war, and that was just like. It was just this mind-boggling concept. I mean, I completely disagree with it. Obviously, you see for reasons why in nuclear war scenario. But that was Billy's position. And so, for as much, like everything about Billy Waugh to me is just, he was a man, he was one of a kind,
Yeah.
As I said at his memorial service, he rode for the brand, right? but I fundamentally disagreed with him on the tactical nuclear weapon. And, we had many arousing conversations about that because, and I think that and again, that she who has never been in war, right? My perspective on that would be like, wow, the government needs to have different kinds of people. You don't want Billy Waugh in charge of your nuclear arsenal, right? And we laugh, but it's not funny.